Hello again, friends. I'm Samuel. Today, I want to talk about the idea of neurodivergence as a minority group, as something separate from simply being disabled, and what effect this has on us, separate from the actual symptoms of autism or ADHD. While sensory or executive function issues can make life challenging, it's the fact that we are in the minority which I think is the largest problem for autistic people. As I laid out in an earlier episode, autistic people make up between 1 and 3% of the population. Our ADHD friends make another 3 or 4%. But there is a significant comorbidity, with 50 to 70% of diagnosed autistic people also having ADHD. So the combined total of our two groups fall well below 5%. The real effect of this minority is that we are pathologized to an excessive level. Our differences, our traits and methods of communication are painted as negative by the scientific community. Neurodivergence is demonized globally by scientists, lawmakers, and even charities. Autism, especially in the US, is talked about in the same way that cancer or tuberculosis is. For example, George W. Bush signed the Combating Autism Act into law, which was supported by Autism Speaks and Cure Autism Now, whose chairman described the law as a federal declaration of war on the epidemic of autism. Autism Speaks is the biggest autism charity in North America, and in 2015 it was the biggest fundraiser in the world. But their focus is not on supporting autistic people, but essentially eradicating them. Their research is all about the causes and so-called risk factors, rather than actually improving the lives of autistic people or advocating for them. Autism Speaks has had a long habit of comparing autism, or Asperger's syndrome, to cystic fibrosis and other life-threatening illnesses. In 2007, other organizations, like NYU's Child Study Center, talked about autism as holding 12 million children hostage and describing it as a psychiatric epidemic and as being like AIDS. In 2009, Autism Speaks created a disgusting piece of propaganda called I Am Autism, saying that autism would cause parents' marriages to fall apart, cause bankruptcy, and it said autism is worse than cancer, diabetes, and AIDS, and that parents of autistic children face struggle, embarrassment, and pain. Autism is vilified to the extent that a debunked trial around the MMR vaccines, which is a little more than a conspiracy theory, has led to hundreds of thousands of parents risking their children becoming seriously sick because they think vaccines cause autism. Despite being disproven in 2005, this misinformation has also led to measles outbreaks in developed countries like the UK, where in 2024, 1 in 10 children haven't had the MMR vaccine when starting school. Autism and ADHD are not diseases. They cannot kill you or cause any harm to you physically. Neurodivergence occurs from structural differences in the brain, which in a neurotypical dominated world has its drawbacks and presents significant challenges, but these differences are not the same as inferiority. For many people, their perception of autism is so entrenched they think it has to be malignant. Even in studies which demonstrate positive or moral autistic characteristics, the results are twisted and interpreted by those scientists as negative. A really key example of this is a study in Brazil, conducted by Hugh et al. In 2020. The abstract tells us all you need to know about Hugh's views towards autistic people, as he refers to non-autistic people as healthy control subjects, a phrase which they repeatedly use throughout the paper. Hugh's experiment consisted of giving neurotypical and autistic participants two propositions that they could agree or disagree to. The first proposal was that they could give money to a charity for education out of their own money. The second proposal was that they could gain money by supporting a group that wanted to exterminate street animals. The participants were asked these questions once in the public setting and again in private. The neurotypical people would often refuse the second question in public, but accept it in private, whereas autistic people's answer would remain the same. Essentially, neurotypical people would be more likely to commit a bad act for monetary gain once you remove societal pressures. Hugh's conclusion that ASD individuals are more inflexible when following a moral rule, although an immoral action can benefit themselves, and experience an increased concern about their ill-gotten gains and the moral cost, is portrayed as a negative behavioural rigidity. Think about what this is saying. Firstly, autistic people are less likely to commit a bad action for their own personal gain. Secondly, An autistic person will not be more likely to commit a bad action if you remove the pressures of society. And yet, Hughes suggests that our moral integrity is down to a flaw in our brains around something called the right temperatorial junction. Hugh et al. Have trapped themselves inside their own stigmatisation of autistic people, to the extent that they have come to the conclusion that doing bad things, as long as they benefit you, is normal, and that it is healthy to be more immoral in private than you are in public. Seemingly, because autistic people are less likely to commit an immoral act, there is something wrong with them. According to Hugh, we have atypical moral behaviours. Because why on earth wouldn't we want stray cats and dogs to die just so we can get some money? I mean, what's wrong with us that we don't want to do that? I mean, come on. The more you read of their discussion section, the worse it gets. They say, autistic spectrum disorder individuals exhibit an excessive evaluation of negative consequences when judging the moral appropriateness of permissible actions. In other words, we think about how our actions affect others before making a decision. During the first question, on giving charity, autistic individuals did not show a difference in the likelihood of giving money to a charity in public or private. So Hugh concluded, ASD individuals, unlike healthy control subjects, blurred the distinction between private and public conditions while making moral decisions. They also said, the first finding confirms that ASD individuals do not appear to take into account their social reputation while making immoral or moral choices. The phrasing of this is infuriating because what it means is we do what we think is right. In this context, we are just as likely to give to a charity if someone is watching us or not. We are honest, is his conclusion. Right? So Hugh's attitude is representative of a very basic societal view. We are different, so we must be bad. But according to almost every moral philosopher in the last 2,400 years, except perhaps Ayn Rand, what Hugh's autistic subjects are doing is good. From Aristotle, who argued that nature has built into us the desire to be virtuous in the same way that acorns are built with the drive to become oak trees, and that virtue is a skill learned through experience. Through to Kant, who argued that to determine what is right you have to use reason and to consider other people, and that something is only a moral rule if it is universalized, if it is applied in all settings. And that doing things because it is the right thing to do is of higher moral standard than doing the right thing because of social pressure. The fact that this study is asking participants to harm animals rather than humans only demonstrates high compassion in those who refuse. The real conclusion to draw from Hugh's study is that autistic adolescents have on average a stronger sense of ethics than neurotypical adolescents. In terms of my disagreement with the Army's hiring practices, Hugh's study seems to make it clear that autistic people will be less likely to commit war crimes than neurotypical soldiers, and by virtue of their own moral compass, not by fear of social or legal repercussions. So, look, I could spend the next few days talking about the positive traits of autism, but I'm not going to. I've made my point. The point I want to make is that if we continue to treat autism and ADHD solely as disabilities, because of their cognitive nature, society, including its scientists and lawmakers, will continue to see us as inferior and use that to justify policies which amount to discrimination. So, I want to suggest how we can change that. There are a number of human rights treaties which specifically address discrimination on specific issues, with the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and of course, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is of immense importance in advocating equality for us. Other human rights treaties, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, also include a key article which guarantee rights to everyone, without discrimination of any kind as to race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. There's two things to highlight here. First, language. To oversimplify, the way neurodivergent people communicate is often reliant on the content of the speech rather than the body language or tone of voice. This is a form of language in the same way that some deaf people communicate using their hands rather than their voice. And to discriminate on language, for instance in employment, is in breach of a country's international obligations under the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The second and more important thing is the other status. This is a part of how LGBT rights got accepted as human rights from a legal point of view. I want to advocate for neurodiversity to be considered as its own status or social category protected by human rights law. This wouldn't be to replace disability. Autism is disabling. That is certainly my lived experience, and it needs to be considered so for autism to be accurately understood. And campaigning for the creation of enabling environments for all will benefit everyone. In the same way that Jewish people are often referred to as overlapping the categories of ethnicity and religion, it is also the case that autism and ADHD are in the middle of a Venn diagram which includes disability and neurodiversity. I think that not only would this provide a broader protection of our human rights and help change the stigmatisation, but it's also more accurate because if you adjust the narrow confines of society and look outside the box and disregard the coherence of social norms, you'll see that some of the greatest achievements in the modern world have come from neurodivergent minds, like Henry Cavendish, who discovered hydrogen, Nikola Tesla, who pioneered advances in electricity and radio technologies, Alan Turing, who invented the digital computer. More recently, Greta Thunberg has led the charge on climate change. While there are plenty of things which make life harder for us, such as the nuances of communication with neurotypical people, sensory issues, burnout, and emotional processing, we are not just a disability. We have potential, and in many ways, it's society that limits us, not our brains. Thank you for listening, guys. I hope you've taken in what I've said and hope you have thoughts on it. Any comments are appreciated. Right, I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.